Karoline Leavitt told security to remove Denzel Washington. Then he did this. Karoline Leavitt paced the stage at the Kay Bailey Hutchison Convention Center in Dallas. The ballroom was packed standing room only. Her voice echoed through the mic as she led the rally, the polished rhetoric, the rehearsed applause, lines, the steady push of campaign messaging. This was her moment, an opportunity to own the stage and unify her supporters. She smiled. She raised her hand. She commanded attention. Behind her, the stagehand crew tightened cables. Close by, Wesley Stokes, her longtime advisor, whispered last-minute reminders. All eyes at the edges of the room scanned for any disruption. Everything was in order. The rally, like many before, carried the crisp, controlled energy of a campaign in motion. Then, from the corner of the press area, a figure emerged. Tall, calm, Denzel Washington. The room shifted instantly. Phones whipped up. A low murmur spread across the crowd. He moved with purpose, no hesitation. Suit blazer, quiet footsteps. A man on a mission. Karoline mid-sentence paused. Her smile faltered. Wesley stiffened. The scripted rhythm of the event cracked. Security glanced over, confused. Nobody recognized the moment yet. But it was coming. Denzel climbed the side aisle, voice calm as he spoke softly into the mic. 60 seconds. His tone held everyone still, no flash, no stage theatrics. Just a request, commanding yet respectful. Security hesitated. A guard spoke into their earpiece. Another shifted foot. Phones lowered slightly. The pause stretched. Karoline looked on, brows knitting. This wasn't in the script. Denzel continued, voice steady. I was invited. He looked past the flashing phones of the press crew. By Representative Noah Harrove. He couldn't make it, so I came in his place. The words landed. The crowd leaned in. Karoline cleared her throat but stayed silent. Wesley tapped his foot. Security edged forward. Denzel raised one hand slightly as if to say, just listen. A hush fell. Phones stopped rolling. Even Karoline's guard relaxed. Sometimes words spoken quietly can change everything. With a single breath, Denzel began, this country needs dialogue, not just cheers. The sentence drifted through the air. He didn't shout. He just spoke. And the room full of partisan fervor shifted. As he reached the front row, the woman standing, older observant, placed a hand on the shoulder of her neighbor. Let him speak, she said. Her voice carried more weight than applause. A ripple of agreement passed through the front rows. Karoline locked eyes with him, arms folded at the podium. She said nothing. Inside, she wrestled with the unexpected. She could regain control, or let this moment unfold. Security folded in. They lowered their posture. Denzel remained calm. His calm held everyone. He looked at Karoline and said, you say this nation thrives on different voices. Let me say mine. Seconds passed. The silence stretched. Karoline shifted weight. The mic crackled softly. The spotlight felt heavy. Every face in the room looked on. Phones rested on laps. Red campaign signs sat untouched. Denzel stood firm, quietly commanding, unscripted. Then Karoline stepped back, half a grin, unsure, a fragment of respect in her eyes. She spoke into her mic. Kanafem. 60 seconds. Soft laughter rippled across the room. The moment was hers to control again and him to use. Denzel nodded once. He stepped forward calm. He began to speak about people, not politics, about listening, about dignity, about respect, about unity, not with applause, but with calm conviction. And just like that, the ballroom waited. Denzel did not take the stage. He stood just below it. No spotlight followed him, but all eyes did. His posture remained relaxed, hands lightly clasped, expression steady. Without raising his voice, he filled the vast ballroom. I'm not here to debate policy today, he began, because this stopped being about policy a long time ago. His words carried far, cutting through the air like a clean blade. Karoline stood behind the podium, arms folded. She watched him intently, her expression neutral, but her mind racing. Wesley Stokes leaned in close, whispering, let it run. If you stop it now, you lose them. She nodded slightly, but kept her gaze locked. Denzel's voice softened. This is about the people, he continued, and how we stop listening the second we hear a name we don't like. I grew up not far from here, South Dallas. Took the DART past this building every day on my way to school. Never thought I'd stand here asking for just a moment to be heard. The crowd leaned forward. The cell phones that had been raised began to lower. The atmosphere shifted. It was no longer a rally. It was no longer campaign theater. It was something quieter and somehow more significant. Karoline sensed it, too. The momentum was no longer hers. Denzel kept going calm and clear. "I'm not here for applause," he said. "I don't need agreement. I just want to remind us all we are not enemies. We are Americans. And if the sound of a different voice is enough to threaten a room, then we've lost more than a debate. We've lost something much deeper." A pause. No one moved. Even Carolina didn't interrupt. She felt the gravity of his words. The weight of the moment pressed on her, too. Then a voice rose from the back corner, a single clap. Hesitant at first, one person, then another. The applause didn't swell into a thunderous ovation, but it was enough. It broke the silence gently, respectfully. Denzel nodded once, grateful, not triumphant. That's all he said simply. And yet the room did not move. Karoline finally stepped forward again. She adjusted the mic. "That's America," she said with a forced smile. Even when you don't want to hear it, her tone mixed sarcasm and unease. The crowd responded with polite laughter. But it was different now, lighter, less certain. As Karoline began to return to her planned talking points, another voice cut in from the crowd. Clear, confident, unshaken. "Why don't you respond to what he just said?" A gasp swept the room. Phones rose again, cameras flashing. The question hung there direct and raw. Karoline froze. For a fraction of a second she hesitated. Then she answered sharply, "I don't need to respond. He has his opinion, I have mine." And I was the one invited to speak. But the crowd was no longer with her in the same way. The dynamic had shifted. The energy felt different, less tribal, more reflective. And then without drama or flourish, Denzel stood again. He didn't rush. He didn't gesture. He simply turned to face the room one last time, his voice low, steady. "Maybe some of you came here needing to hear something different. Not better, not perfect, just different." Then he left quietly, calmly. No one stopped him. As he reached the edge of the room, his phone vibrated. Message after message lit up the screen. The moment was already outside the ballroom, racing through social media, crossing digital borders. Back inside, Karoline struggled to recenter herself. She rifled through her notes, but felt the momentum slipping from her grasp. Her next lines felt flat, rehearsed phrases spoken into a room that had changed shape. And it had changed. A man in a red golf shirt stood in the middle row. He spoke loudly enough for all to hear Mr. Washington. "I don't agree with you on much, but you said that better than most people ever could." Respect. Karoline forced a smile, half joking, half desperate. "Well, aren't we full of surprises today?" But the crowd didn't laugh this time. Some smiled faintly, others remained quiet. The temperature of the room was no longer hers to command. Reporters scrambled for their devices. Cameras zoomed in. Clips were already being edited and uploaded. The viral cycle had begun, and Karoline knew it. Denzel didn't linger outside either. As he made his way through the corridor, a small group approached. One man jogged to catch up. "Mr. Washington," he called out. Denzel stopped, turned, and waited. The man hesitated, then spoke quickly. "Didn't expect to listen to anyone from your side today." "But I did, and I'm glad I did." Denzel met his gaze directly. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply said, "You listened." That's more than most are willing to do. Inside the private lounge backstage, Karoline paced like a storm trapped in a room. Her aide spoke softly, offering suggestions she couldn't hear. Wesley Stokes stayed back, calm, calculating. Karoline finally stopped, her expression hardened. "Who let him in?" she snapped. An aide stammered Representative Harrove's credentials. "Technically, he was a guest." Karoline scoffed. Technically is how they sneak past you. Hackers, spies, opponents." Her eyes darted to a monitor in the corner, a still frame of Denzel frozen mid-sentence, serene and composed. "He didn't even tremble," Karoline muttered. Wesley finally spoke. "You didn't lose the room," he said carefully. "But you didn't own it either." That moment, it's everywhere now. Nobody's talking policy anymore. They're talking about him. Karoline fell silent. She hated the truth of it. He's not the future, she said finally. He's noise. But Wesley shrugged. Noise travels fast. Karoline slumped into a chair. The screen still showed Denzel frozen, but somehow alive with quiet force. Outside, her team scrambled to draft a response statement. Ignoring it wasn't an option. This moment had already escaped their control. Denzel Washington left the convention center and stepped into the warm Dallas evening. His walk was steady, his breathing calm, but the weight of what had happened inside was beginning to register not in his words, but in the dozens of vibrations from his phone. In the vendor parking lot, clusters of attendees still lingered, heads bent over glowing screens, watching the moment they had just witnessed now looping online. Some were replaying it on social media feeds. Others stood silent as if trying to absorb what they had felt but couldn't articulate. Inside the hall, Karoline Leavitt was still on stage, but her rhythm was broken. She spoke into the mic, reading talking points that now felt disconnected from the audience's mood. Where before there had been chants and cheers, there were now murmurs and distracted eyes. Even the applause sounded thinner, automatic, rather than enthusiastic. Denzel's presence hadn't just interrupted her rally, it had transformed it. The real rally now was online. At a small cafe down the street, a group of young volunteers huddled around a phone, scrolling through comments under the first video clip posted just minutes earlier. One comment stood out: "Didn't expect to agree with Denzel Washington today." But wow, respect. Another: "This is how you change minds, not by yelling, by being real." By nightfall, hashtags were trending. After 60 seconds, "Let him speak," different voice. Even cable news, which had not intended to cover this rally in detail, broke into coverage. On one screen, a conservative pundit insisted it was a media stunt. On another, a liberal commentator praised the rare moment of quiet power. But neither side could deny it. Something unscripted had cut through the noise. In Denzel's home that evening, the lights were low. He sat at his kitchen table. His phone buzzed endlessly, but he left most messages unread. Instead, he stared quietly out the window at the street beyond. His press manager, Reuben Sloan, finally knocked on the door and let himself in. "You didn't expect this, did you?" Reuben asked, settling into a chair across from him. "No," Denzel admitted softly. "I just couldn't sit there and let it all pass me by. I couldn't stay quiet." Reuben nodded. "PBS wants you for a one-on-one interview. Pennsylvania is asking if you'd speak at their town hall next week. Even Fox News wants a segment." Denzel didn't answer immediately. He folded his hands and took a breath. "I didn't do it for this," he said. "I just wanted to remind people that disagreement doesn't have to mean hatred." A pause. Then he added, "But what scares me more than the reaction is that this felt rare." Reuben tilted his head, curious. "What do you mean? That speaking calmly, asking just to be heard?" "That shouldn't feel extraordinary," Denzel said. "And yet here we are." Elsewhere across the country, people were already dissecting the moment. In Washington, D.C., a campaign strategist scribbled ideas for a new ad campaign that might capture that same tone, calm, clarity, conviction. In Florida, a major donor quietly reconsidered their next round of funding for Karoline Leavitt's campaign. In homes, cafes, and offices, people who didn't normally pay close attention to politics shared grainy clips of Denzel's words. This wasn't a speech one viewer commented online. This was a reminder. Meanwhile, back at the convention center, a very different conversation unfolded backstage. Karoline's team gathered around a small table, laptops open, rapid-fire typing. "We need a statement," one aide said. "Quick, before the narrative gets away from us." But Wesley Stokes was more deliberate. "No statement is going to fix this tonight," he said. "The tone has changed. We can't spin this moment away. We need to regroup." Karoline sat silently for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice low but sharp. "I won't let this define my campaign." But inside, even she felt it. The ground had shifted under her feet. The next morning, Denzel chose not to make public statements. He didn't post a single tweet. He didn't call reporters. Instead, he went for a walk through South Dallas, his old neighborhood. People recognized him. Some nodded quietly. Others came up to shake his hand. No loud declarations, just simple acknowledgement. At a small bakery, a young woman in scrubs approached shyly. "Are you," she began. Denzel smiled gently. I am, he answered. She hesitated, then placed a folded note on his table. This is from my dad, she explained. He doesn't do social media, but he asked me to write something down for you. Then she walked away. Denzel unfolded the note slowly. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. It read, I don't agree with you, but I listened. He sat back in his chair, letting those words sink in. Later that afternoon, a local journalist, Shelby Dunn, sat across from him for a quiet interview. I've covered politics in Texas for 20 years, she told him. I've seen loud rallies, loud protests, loud everything. But I've never seen a room stop the way that one did last night. Denzel didn't respond right away. Then he said, I wasn't trying to stop anything. I just wanted to offer a voice they didn't expect. Shelby leaned in. You knew the risk, didn't you? Yes, he admitted. But I wasn't scared. A pause. What scared me more, he added, was what it would mean if I stayed silent. Shelby asked a final question. Do you think the reaction would have been the same if you'd shouted? Denzel shook his head gently. No. That room wasn't built for my anger. If I'd raised my voice, they would have tuned me out before I even said hello. He let the thought hang in the air for a moment. But when I didn't raise my voice, they had to choose. And most of them stayed. In those words lay the heart of the moment. It was never about dominating a stage. It wasn't about applause. It was about presence, about showing up with dignity, clarity, and a willingness to simply speak. And across the country, people noticed. In a coffee shop in Philadelphia, two men from opposite ends of the political spectrum sat at the same table watching the same video clip. In a diner in Ohio, a trucker watched the replay on his phone while stirring his coffee slowly. In California, a group of college students debated not whether they agreed with Denzel, but whether they could replicate that kind of conversation themselves. Back in Dallas, even as Karoline's team worked overtime to regain control of the narrative, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And no one, especially Karoline, could deny that. Backstage at the convention center, Karoline Leavitt sat alone for a few minutes before rejoining her team. The sound of muted applause from the ballroom filtered in through the heavy curtains, but it felt distant, like applause meant for someone else. Her staff clustered around Wesley Stokes, who spoke in clipped, strategic tones. This isn't about what he said, Wesley insisted. It's about who owned the moment. We can't let this moment define you. But Karoline knew it already had. In just 60 seconds, Denzel Washington had shifted the energy of the entire event. Not by shouting, not by hijacking the stage, but by simply standing there calm and present while telling a story that was impossible to ignore. Karoline's frustration simmered under the surface. She prided herself on control over language, over tone, over the script. That control had slipped the moment Denzel walked into her rally. Now back at headquarters, her communications team drafted statements to recenter the narrative. The proposed headlines, Karoline Leavitt delivers fiery speech in Dallas. But even they knew that wasn't true. The fire belonged elsewhere that evening. Meanwhile, outside the convention hall, attendees still lingered. The conversations weren't about Karoline's agenda. They were about him. A Marine veteran, Jasper Thorne, leaned against a pillar near the coffee stand. I'm a Karoline supporter, he said, always have been. But the way that man carried himself tonight, it hit different. His friend, a small business owner, nodded in agreement. He didn't insult anyone. He didn't call names. He didn't mock. He just spoke like he was supposed to be there. That sentiment echoed in smaller clusters across the venue at the coffee stations near the exits, even among campaign volunteers who instinctively sensed that the mood had changed. And Karoline could feel it too. She took her time leaving the stage, but when she finally exited into the service hallway, she paused and asked one of her senior aides, "Did we record that whole thing?" "Yes, ma'am," the aide replied cautiously. Karoline nodded. "Send me the full clip tonight. I want to watch it." That admission was rare for her, an acknowledgement that she didn't fully understand what had happened and that she needed to see it from the outside as her audience had. That evening, back at her campaign headquarters, Karoline sat alone in her office. She played the video on loop. She scrutinized her own body language as Denzel spoke, arms folded, jaw-tight, slight movements betraying her discomfort. She watched the crowd's reaction too. The subtle ways they leaned in the quiet, they offered him the respect they gave without clapping wildly or chanting slogans. And she noticed something else, how quickly the moment escaped her control. Each time she tried to reclaim the room with sarcasm, with sharp retorts, with jokes, the responses felt flat. By contrast, Denzel didn't try to control anything. He didn't play to the crowd. He didn't posture. He just spoke. That was the most dangerous thing about it, she realized his simplicity. Across town at Denzel's home, he remained silent. His press manager, Reuben Sloan, sat nearby, still fielding calls and emails. CNN's asking for an exclusive, Reuben said. MSNBC, too. Even a late-night show wants to book you this week. But Denzel shook his head. Not yet, he said. Not tonight, Reuben frowned. You're trending everywhere, Denzel. Everyone's talking about you. We could amplify this. But Denzel replied quietly, I didn't show up to become a headline. I showed up because I couldn't sit in silence anymore. Reuben fell silent. He knew better than to push. Instead, he asked one final question. Do you regret it? Denzel took a long pause before answering. I regret that speaking quietly feels radical now, he said. That it makes headlines just because I didn't shout. Elsewhere in the country, people were still watching. In a living room in Pennsylvania, a retired truck driver played the video clip for his daughter. I've voted Republican my whole life, he said quietly. But that man said something worth hearing. His daughter, a nurse, nodded. Yeah, he didn't ask them to agree, he just asked them to listen. In a coffee shop in Seattle College, students debated not the politics of the speech, but the style, the absence of bombast, the presence of dignity. On cable news, analysts tried to dissect the moment from all angles. Was it a stunt, one anchor asked. But her guest, a veteran political strategist, shook his head. If it was a stunt, it would have been louder. It would have been flashier. What made it resonate was that it felt unscripted. Back in Dallas, Shelby Dunn prepared her column for the next day's paper. Her lead sentence read simply, no one expected a 60-second speech to define a political rally. But it did. She described not just the words Denzel had spoken, but the effect it had on the room. How people had stopped filming, stopped clapping, stopped reacting, and started listening. Her closing line was even simpler. It wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the stillness that followed. At campaign headquarters, Karoline's advisors drafted talking points for the next day's interviews. Wesley Stokes spoke quietly but firmly, tomorrow they'll ask you about this. Don't deny it happened, but don't give it too much oxygen either. Deflect, pivot, stay on your agenda. Karoline listened carefully but said nothing. In the back of her mind, she kept returning to that still frame of Denzel frozen mid-sentence, calm, clear, unshaken. The photo was already everywhere online. She knew that image would follow her for weeks. But she also understood, perhaps for the first time, that she couldn't outshout it. The room hadn't chosen sides. It had chosen presence. In the hours that followed, articles appeared across the ideological spectrum. Some conservative voices called Denzel's appearance an intrusion, disrespectful, even manipulative. But even those critiques felt hollow, as if they couldn't quite grasp why the moment had worked. Others praised it as a rare example of grace under pressure, a reminder that politics could still accommodate quiet conviction. But through it all, one truth remained constant. The moment had happened. It couldn't be undone, and no statement from Karoline's team could recenter the narrative. It now belonged to everyone who had watched it unfold both in the room and online. At a breakfast diner the next morning, a waitress refilled a trucker's coffee as he rewatched the clip on his phone. Something about that man, he murmured. He didn't ask for permission to speak. He just spoke like he belonged there. At another table, a teacher grading papers glanced up from the same clip. That's the difference, she said softly to no one in particular. He didn't come in shouting, so they couldn't tune him out. And in a quiet house on the outskirts of Dallas, Denzel sat at his kitchen table. The noise outside grew louder, news coverage online, debates, invitations. But inside he remained still. He had said what he came to say. And that was enough. 2 mornings after the rally, Denzel sat in a small cafe in Oak Cliff, Dallas, a place he used to pass by as a kid but rarely stopped in. He wore a baseball cap low, hoping to slip in unnoticed. But quiet doesn't last long when a country has decided you've become something symbolic. The barista recognized him first. Mr. Washington, she whispered. He offered a polite nod but kept his head down, fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. A young woman in scrubs entered, hesitated, then approached. I watched that clip 3 times yesterday, she said, smiling nervously. My dad's a trucker. He voted for Karoline every time. But after hearing you, he got real quiet. She placed a folded note on his table. He doesn't do social media, she explained, so he asked me to give this to you. Denzel unfolded it after she left. The handwriting was neat but firm. I don't agree with you, but I listened. That's more than I can say for most. The words carried more weight than a headline. Later that afternoon, Denzel sat for a local interview. Shelby Dunn, the veteran Texas politics reporter, leaned in close as she spoke. In all my years covering the state, she said, I've never seen a room stop like that, not for applause, not for anger, but for stillness. Denzel reflected quietly before answering. I wasn't trying to stop anything. I just wanted to offer something that room never hears, that it's okay to disagree without assuming hatred. Shelby pushed gently. You knew it was risky walking into that room. He nodded. Yes, but I wasn't scared. She tilted her head, intrigued. Why not? I've been in far smaller rooms, Denzel replied with far louder men. He let that truth sit there. Then he added, what scared me more was what it would mean if I stayed silent. Word of what happened in Dallas spread not just online, but into other spaces, dinner tables, classrooms, break rooms. In a small town in Ohio, a father and daughter watched the replay together. He didn't shout, the father observed. He just said what he came to say. The daughter replied thoughtfully, that's why they had to listen. In a high school civics class in Pennsylvania, a teacher paused the lesson to play the clip. This, he told his students, is how you command a room not by volume, but by presence. At Karoline Leavitt's campaign headquarters, staff worked overtime drafting statements trying to reset the narrative. Wesley Stokes paced as he spoke to aides. It's not about what he said. It's about who controlled the stage. We have to reclaim the narrative. But Karoline herself was quieter than usual. She reviewed footage of the rally again and again, focusing not just on Denzel's words, but on her own reactions. Each time she interrupted him, the energy in the room dipped. Each sarcastic remark fell flat. Each attempt to pivot back to her talking points felt disconnected. Meanwhile, Denzel hadn't needed a script. He hadn't needed applause lines. He hadn't needed campaign signage. His power lay in his refusal to play the game. That was what unsettled Karoline the most. Even conservative pundits who usually supported her could not avoid mentioning the shift in atmosphere. One anchor on a major news channel observed, it wasn't a partisan win or loss. It was a human moment, and that's why it stuck. Another noted Karoline may have regained the mic, but she didn't regain the room. Across Dallas, people kept talking about the moment, but Denzel stayed local. While reporters clamored for interviews and invitations poured in from national networks, he walked through his old neighborhood, greeting neighbors, speaking with small business owners, thanking teachers. I don't want to become a headline, he told Rubin that evening. I want them to know I'm still a neighbor. For Denzel, the message mattered more than the attention. And that quiet resistance, his refusal to capitalize on virality, made the impact deeper. In a time where political discourse was dominated by loud voices and sharp insults, he had modeled something different: restraint, dignity, clarity. Not everyone agreed with him, but many had listened, and that he knew was the most anyone could ask for. Back at the convention center, the energy never fully returned to normal. By the next day, no one was talking about tax policy, immigration reform, or infrastructure. They were talking about 60 seconds of stillness. During a short break at a policy panel, a few attendees gathered near the coffee station. No arguing, no hashtags, just quiet conversation. Jasper Thorne, the Marine veteran, leaned against a pillar and said, I'll vote for Karoline again, but I can't lie. The way Denzel stood there, it hit me different. He didn't demand respect. He earned it. Even inside the next panel discussion, the mood lingered. State Senator Colin Greer paused his remarks mid-topic. I wasn't going to mention this, he said, but pretending it didn't happen would be dishonest. Denzel Washington came here and in 60 seconds reminded us what courage looks like. You don't have to like him. You don't even have to agree. But courage still matters in politics. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was genuine. In a time when volume often triumphed over value, Denzel had cut through simply by refusing to play the game. But while others debated the moment's meaning, Denzel himself had already moved on. He spent the following day walking through neighborhoods that shaped him. He visited schools, stopped at a corner store, exchanged quiet greetings with old friends. His team urged him to seize the momentum. Go national, they said. This could be your moment, but he declined. Let them know I didn't turn into a headline, he told Rubin. I'm still a neighbor. Because Denzel understood something most didn't. Once you show people a better way to be heard, they start expecting better not just from you, but from everyone. In homes across America, families replayed that moment. Some admired it, others debated it, but none could ignore it. And in Oak Cliff, where Denzel sat quietly at the same cafe as before, a young man in a hoodie approached and said softly, You changed the tone, sir. Not sides, tone. Denzel smiled gently. I didn't come here to win, he said, just to remind them what listening sounds like, and that was exactly what he had done. The moment passed, but the echo remained.